What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today we've got kind of a grab bag of topics sort of kicking off from last week's episode, talking about the new information we learned at the Warcraft Direct live stream. But first, quick note, I have a bunch of sample products from the new line that is available at my merch store at devilor.com. That includes this hat, that includes this wonderful shirt. It's a shirt, I promise. That includes this super cool glass now with this like lid thing with it too, which is very cool. You can head over to devilor.com and check those out. Really appreciate you taking a look. Let's get into today's episode. So I want to start off today by talking about a couple of like updates, new information, and some clarifying factors of stuff that we talked about last week. I'm going to start off talking about that player housing rune, which we now know to be a player housing rune. And the biggest reason we know that is because they just changed it on the actual roadmap image, like maybe an hour after I put up the video. They changed the little sort of semi-cryptic. Yes, a lot of people were like, oh, that's obviously a house. It didn't look anything like a house to me. But then again, I live in Southern California where every house looks like that. So didn't really strike me as anything house related directly, theoretically, but there were some other options. Anyway, doesn't matter because now they've changed it to be something that is very clearly referencing player housing in World of Warcraft. And that's interesting to me for a few reasons. One is, why was it this other weird like semi-cryptic rune in the first place? Like, my immediate thought on that explanation, like why would they have the other one in there, why did they change it so quickly, is just that maybe they didn't intend for it to be so cryptic. Maybe this was supposed to be something that like, oh yeah, everyone will know that that's player housing, and then there were people like me who were like, it might be player housing, but it might be one of these 7 other things. And they were like, okay, hold on, we don't want too much speculation about what that could be, because now people are coming up with all these ideas and stuff. And sometimes when ideas get out of hand, that turns into people then later being disappointed at an announcement because it wasn't the thing that they thought it was going to be. So that could be one reason for it. Another reason that I can think of is maybe when the graphic was originally made, they weren't actually sure if they were going to include that player housing teaser or not. They weren't sure if that was going to be something that was actually part of the live stream. And so then later on, they didn't go back and update the graphic before they put it out. And then after it came out, they're like, okay, hold on. Actually, we've now teased that this is player housing, so we should be a little bit more direct about this thing. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they changed their minds about whether or not they wanted to be cryptic about it all in the first place. Maybe they were just like, originally we thought maybe it'd be fun to make people speculate about this, but people figured it out so fast that maybe they then decided that they didn't want that anymore. I don't know. There's lots of reasons why this might have happened. It literally could just have been that the asset was something that was made, and then later they were like, no, we'd rather this be a more direct thing. Could be that simple. Could be something more along the lines of like, well, people figured it out and we wanted to be more obvious about it. Could be that some of the ideas that people were theorizing that it could have been otherwise were things that they didn't want to get too out of hand. They didn't want people going too far down the path of like, well, maybe the rune means delves or something like that. So instead, they decided, let's just be honest about it. Let's be straightforward. It's obviously player housing. But there's still a couple of interesting things to speculate about this location on the timeline and the actual graphic itself. For one, it's now very clear, whereas before it was kind of hidden a little bit more. Now with the new graphic, it's very clear that this is smack dab right over the top of Northrend, which is just an interesting choice. I don't know for certain if that is directly meant to be a tease towards something taking place in Northrend. Maybe this is something that they're kind of implying that the first player housing will be in Northrend somewhere. Maybe it will be that log cabin in Grizzly Hills that I was talking about a couple of episodes ago, where I was theorizing about player housing. Like maybe that's what they're kind of trying to tease there, that Northrend might be one of the first places where you can actually have a in-world player house. I don't know. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe they just decided to use the map as a backdrop for their little rune on the thing, because they needed something to be there. So they're like, hey, it'd be cool if we put it on top of the world map. And that's just the section that they happen to choose. It's a little bit too like perfectly squared up for me to think that it's just accidentally that's where it landed. But who knows? The fact that it's over top of Northrend is still interesting. And I don't think it's just like coincidence and that it's like some sort of red herring or something. I think there's a reason that it's over top of Northrend, and I don't know what that is yet. The timing of it is also really interesting because this is like immediately after 11.2.7. This is nowhere near where I would expect at the very least for the War Within pre-patch to be occurring as of yet. And yet the announcement said that player housing was coming in not War Within, midnight. The announcement said that it was coming in midnight. So if this is coming ahead of midnight in some capacity, is this some sort of like pre-housing event sort of thing? Is this like a housing PTR that they're going to do? A specific, like, is this saying when housing is going to be accessible on the midnight beta for players to be able to test around with? I don't know. It's interesting that it is specifically pointing out player housing when there is yet so little details about midnight available. Obviously, we do have the expansion reveal for World of Warcraft Midnight happening end of summer, and this is at the start of winter. So it could make sense that this is some sort of thing that will occur related to player housing being testable in some capacity or something like that. But I doubt this is the point where player housing is fully available to players unless they've got some other sort of like mini event like Plunderstorm or Remix in mind that is focused around player housing. Maybe something that they'll do. Maybe here's a crazy idea. Maybe they'll have some sort of like decorate your home competition that happens where there's a separate like little mode that you get to go in and decorate a house or something. And they're like, hey, here you go, have a house and you can go decorate and play around that. I don't know. There's a lot of things that could potentially be. I don't think this is showing when it's going to be available in game as a full featured thing, because again, they said it was coming in midnight. And I'm going to believe that their intention is that player housing is not fully available in WoW until midnight actually comes out. Unless that is all now already out of the question as well. And maybe it will be available in midnight by virtue of the fact that it was included in the War Within and midnight came afterwards. I don't know. There's a lot to kind of speculate about this right now. It's very interesting stuff. And I don't know. I'm still really curious what y'all's theories are on why is it at this position? Why is it over top of Northrend and so on? There's a lot that could mean. It could also mean a whole lot of absolutely nothing. Who knows? I'll also point out that there was one other minor addition to the 2025 roadmap, which to me, I hadn't even noticed really that it was missing before, but their 11.2 banner didn't previously state that there was going to be a new zone in 11.2, but they went back and added that in. I assume this is because a bunch of people noticed that. I didn't, but I assume some people did notice and were like, hey, does this mean we're not actually getting a new zone in 11.2? That's a little bit weird and kind of unprecedented for a major patch to not have a new area to go to, at least for the last like several expansions. So I can understand why they would want to go back and add that back in, but rest assured, it does seem like we are in fact getting some sort of a new zone. They haven't said anything about what it is as of yet, but we are getting some sort of new zone added in 11.2. I did also want to go back and give some clarifying points and talk a little bit more about some comments that I made in the last episode about Warcraft 1, because I mentioned that Warcraft 1 doesn't have a lot of story to it. And that, if you're talking about the video game, that is correct. Warcraft 1, the video game, does not contain much in the way of story. A lot of people pointed out that there is a lot of lore that came out of Warcraft 1. That is correct. There is a lot that was later clarified, especially in Warcraft 2, which canonized and even retconned a bunch of stuff that happened in the Warcraft 1 video game. There's a lot of stuff that changed later that was then built out of some of the things that were mentioned in Warcraft 1. But the point of what I was saying, context is important, guys. The point of what I was saying in last episode was Warcraft 1 is not a game to go play to experience the story. Yeah, there's a little bit of it there. There's kind of some stuff that's going on, but most of it is like a full half of the game is no longer canon. They went back in Warcraft 2 and said, yeah, the Alliance campaign just didn't happen. And then later they've taken some bits and pieces from the Alliance campaign that they decided to make canon later on, but actually then removed some things from the Orc campaign that now no longer exist and stuff like that. So it's a game that it's an interesting game to play academically. It's cool to go back and see where this all came from and what the original early beginnings of the Warcraft universe were like. But it's not a game to play for the story. There just isn't much there in the Warcraft 1 video game. Yes, there are a whole bunch of things that have later been novelized and alluded to and put in other games and so on. And yes, they did make a whole movie out of what is theoretically the story of Warcraft 1, but none of that story was in the game. It just wasn't there. Basically, the story of Warcraft 1 is you are either nameless orc leader. Yes, it was later clarified to be Orgrim Doomhammer, but that's one of those things that happened in Warcraft 2 that I'm talking about. Didn't happen in Warcraft 1. but you are nameless orc leader or nameless alliance leader, and you're just fighting off the horde or you're fighting off the alliance. That's basically it. Anyway, like I said at the end of last week's episode, I was asking for a whole bunch of questions and you guys delivered. So I want to get through a bunch of these questions that you guys sent in because a lot of these are really, really interesting things to think about and interesting things to discuss. We're going to start with this series of questions from Dead and Cold, who said, with the possibility, it's two questions, with the possibility of Legion Remix being next, in your opinion, what is the reasoning behind what X specs they chose for Remix? Why start with MOP and not TBC/Wrath? And why skip Warlords of Draenor? If starting with MOP for Remix was the way to gauge the reception for MOP Classic, could skipping WAD be an indicator they might be considering skipping WAD for Classic? So first of all, that's 3, maybe 4 questions, not 2 questions, if I'm just being a little pedantic for a second. But they're interesting questions, so let's talk about this a little bit more. I'd actually considered making a full episode about all of this, but then this series of questions came in, so I thought, hey, here's an opportunity to answer some questions and also talk about something that I kind of wanted to talk about anyway. So starting with the first question, possibility of Legion Remix being next. What is the reasoning behind what expansions they choose for Remix? So first, straight out of the gate, this is all coming from a, let's be honest, relatively flimsy assumption that the fact that the end of the timeline on the 2025 roadmap starts to turn green means Legion Remix. Like, yes, that's a reasonable theory that might be a tease for that, but it could be a tease for any number of other things. I saw someone mention maybe it's a tease that they're going to Xbox for some reason. And that, like, that's also a bit of a stretch, but I mean, Xbox is green, like green is Xbox's color, right? So I don't know, that could make sense too. Anyway, but starting from that assumption that that's what that even means in the first place, I think this probably comes from the sense of like Remix being a way to make a lot of fun out of going back to expansions that people were really, really excited for the story of, right? Because think about this way. Classic is re-experiencing the entire expansion more or less as it was. Obviously, in later expansions, they've been doing more and more like subtle changes in quality of life stuff here and there, but it's still like the classes are built the same way they were back then. The raids are meant to be difficult, and so on and so forth. The content is meant to be experienced in the similar, at the very least, paradigm to how it was back when that was actually fresh and new and the most recent WoW expansion. Remix is different. Remix is going back to experience the like leveling and questing experience and experiencing that content, but outside of the confines of how the game was back then. It's with a more modern twist. It's kind of taking about, like, you can even play, like, you could play a demon hunter going back into like Mists of Pandaria Remix, for example. So there's a lot that it just doesn't match up the same way, and thus it's a very different experience, and also means that it's coming from that core aspect of what is a expansion that the story would be something that people, and the questing and everything would be something that people would be excited to go back and experience. And I don't think that's really the case for Warlords of Draenor. Like, yes, there are people who loved Warlords of Draenor's storyline. There are people who loved the Garrison. Video games are subjective. There's going to be someone who likes it no matter what. But I think if you're talking about like what is going to hit the largest number of players and what's going to be exciting for the largest number of players, Legion definitely has quite a leg up over something like Warlords of Draenor. I also think that part of the answer to this question comes from the third question that Dead and Cold put in there with, if starting with MOP for Remix was a way to gauge the reception for MOP Classic, could skipping WAD be an indicator they might be considering skipping WAD for Classic? I think that part of what we're seeing right now is this interesting conundrum. I was talking about this a little bit last week as well, where they now have Mists of Pandaria Classic coming out while Mists of Pandaria Remix is still fresh in everybody's minds. And I think part of what might make sense for this is putting a bit more of a gap. So if Classic, I do expect the Classic will continue on to Warlords of Draenor. And I expect that like the Classic continuation will be just keep going through all the expansions, no matter what the expansion was, keep on going through it. So in that case, if the next Classic expansion is Warlords of Draenor, then it does make some amount of sense to try and avoid the situation we have right now, where players will have just recently gone through all of that content, and yet now it's coming out again, right? So explaining a little bit more what I mean by that. There are going to be a lot of players who would have checked out Mists of Pandaria Classic because they wanted to go back and revisit that content and experience it again, but now are not going to because they just did those quests. They just did those raids in Mop Remix, and the thought of experiencing that, but it's actually how the game was at the time, isn't different enough from what they just did that's actually exciting and interesting to them. There's going to be a lot of people who are like Mop Remix or Mop Classic. I just did Mop Remix. I don't really feel like going back and doing that again right now. So I think there is some element of it making sense for Blizzard to try and gap that out a little bit more, space that out a little bit more, and say, okay, let's do Legion Remix next instead of Warlords of Draenor Remix, so that way, by the time Classic gets around to Legion, it's been longer since Legion Remix. Now, there's also questions to ask in there, like, okay, why not then do Wrath of the Lich King remix? Why not do TBC remix, and so on? And that to me is enough of like, there's enough to think about there to then think that maybe some of that aspect of that line of thinking is making some assumptions that are unnecessary or incorrect assumptions. But that's just kind of, those are the assumptions that I think are semi-reasonable to make at this juncture, and theoretically there's some way that could translate into that, like maybe that's what they're thinking. I'm not sure. I also think that Remix didn't necessarily, like, I have a theory thinking about, like, why start with Mists of Pandaria in the first place instead of TBC or Wrath, why skip Warlords of Draenor, etc. I have this theory that Remix maybe didn't necessarily start with the idea of let's go back to a prior expansion and figure out how to make that new. I think it started with the idea of let's figure out what a cool PvE event could be. Okay, but we need some content to base this around. Like, they came up with the gems, they came up with the leveling, they came up with all the other, like, systems that were behind Mop Remix, and then said, okay, but we need content to do this in. Let's just send people to Mists of Pandaria then. And so that was why I would not be surprised, at the very least, if the method by which this was determined was the other way around. They started with the remix concept, or what eventually became the remix concept, in terms of the systems and the gameplay and the elements that were there. Because again, remember that this was originally phrased as this was the, like, PvE response to the PvP mode of Plunderstorm, with Blizzard trying different ways to interject these, like, little mini events where the gameplay was changed relatively dramatically. So I think, given that in mind, and giving that, okay, Plunderstorm is this PvP event, let's come up with what a PvE event could be like. Well, what if it was about leveling and growing in power, and maybe we changed around how gear worked so that you were equipping gems and stuff like this. I don't think the gems really worked out all that well. At least the stat gems were pretty boring. But doing all of this stuff with changing up how the straight up leveling experience works, cool. That's an interesting concept. Hey, let's put it in Mists of Pandaria, like taking the concept of the gameplay and applying that to the content of Mists of Pandaria, instead of the other way around of being like, hey, let's send people back to Mists of Pandaria. Okay, good idea. Let's figure out how to make it interesting. The direction by which that we got to that end result, I think, was the other way around. But again, that's all just theories and speculation and just whatever thoughts happen to come to mind for me. And apparently I am firing thoughts off like crazy today, which is good. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm a content creator. That's what I'm here for. But let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Nyamagam on YouTube, who said, with the 10.0.7 Siren Island having flight restricted for the first few weeks, and 10.1 having a ground mount as a main feature, what are your thoughts of restricted flying in new zones? So I've been thinking about this myself, because I'm not a fan of restricting flying. I'm not a fan of going back to that. I know that it's something that Blizzard has been trying to do for a long time, and a lot of this is honestly just like Warlords of Draenor PTSD for me, because I was a community manager and flying was a big ambiguous will it won't it sort of thing back then. And I just remember very vividly how angry everyone was that flying wasn't something that they could do, like, right away, or didn't even know when they could do it. And so every time Blizzard tries to go back to maybe we don't have flying for a little bit, I'm always like, that hasn't been good the last, like, 8 times you've tried it. Please stop trying to do that. Now, it's entirely possible that the way they're implementing it in Siren Island is going to be fine. Like, it is pretty much it's just like a time gated sort of thing, and then you just get it later. Is my understanding at the very least. I don't remember exactly what the unlock process is meant to be for Siren Island, but from what I understand, it's not meant to be anything super complicated. So realistically, you just get it after a few weeks. But anyway, um, that could be fine. But as I mentioned in, I don't remember which episode it was, it's important to remember that it's fine and it's good are two different things. Is it going to make this content update suck? Probably not. Is it going to improve this content update? I don't know. My guess is also probably not, as opposed to just building it around flying existing in the first place. Uh, Honestly, like going through the leveling process in the War Within and being able to fly everywhere. Yeah, sure. There was a bunch of times where it was just like, okay, new quest is over there. Up I go into the air and back I go back down. And yes, you're jumping past things and you're missing a lot of the stuff that's going on in the zones. In fact, there was one question that I didn't pull out for this episode, but someone was asking about. It was actually thinking about it. I think it was the second part of Neomagam's question where they were asking about uh, the zone design in the War Within, and specifically mentioned that Aj didn't feel like dangerous or anything. And the fact that you could fly everywhere is obviously a big part of that. Like, oh no, I'm in danger. I'm not in danger anymore. Goodbye. Like that's just kind of how things ended up. So I can understand the perspective, like I can understand the designer's perspective of trying to get back to some element of, yes, you do actually have to explore this world. You actually have to walk around and do stuff. And then when you're flying everywhere all the time, I think that directly leads to things like zones feeling empty and not feeling danger and so on and so forth. Like those are direct results of that occurring. That said, I think it's fine. Like I think it's okay for that to be a problem compared to it feels awful trying to get around everywhere. Maybe the like first few weeks thing will just be like, yeah, by the time I'm getting annoyed at the travel, now I don't have to worry about that anymore. So maybe that will work out and maybe it will end up being a good thing. I'm just not fully convinced. What I do like, however, is what they're doing in 10.1, where they're adding in this new like actual ground mount and making active ground mounts a thing where you're actually driving around and doing interesting stuff on the ground instead of just walking from place to place. I think I like that approach a lot more to trying to make it more interesting to be spending time on the ground by actually making travel on the ground something that's fun to do instead of just walking from place to place and hoping that you don't aggro things. Like, yeah, let me get in my car and just speed past things and leave those bozos in the dust, but they're still chasing me. They can still shoot at me, but I'm just out here driving and drifting and doing my whole thing. Like that sounds at least a bit more interesting to me in that context, and with that system available, I will be more accepting of the, yeah, okay, maybe we don't have flying for a little bit because we have this fun thing to do on the ground instead anyways. That to me feels better than just, hey, that thing you like doing, can't do it. Can't do it. Nope, not allowed, because then you would have less fun. Like, I'm always I'm always skeptical. Like there are genuinely cases where this occurs where a developer is like, you will have more fun if you don't do the thing that you think is going to be fun. There are genuinely cases where that does occur. But I think given how flying has gone in World of Warcraft over the past, I don't know, 10 years at this point, I think that's a hill to just leave alone. Like, stop dying on that hill, please. Stay away from that hill. Every time you go there to that hill, you die on it, and we would like to no more dying on that hill, please. That's kind of where I'm at with all that at this point. We'll see how things work out in Siren Isle, and especially in the Undermined update when the like goblin car thing, the goblin race car thing comes in, because that I'm genuinely really excited about, and I really want to see how that works out. So we'll see how that goes. Let's move on to our next question. This one comes from Keylord on YouTube, who said, do you think the fresh classic servers would go to Wrath of Lich King, then Kata, then Mop? I'm eager to know if the classic servers would end up going through all the expansions until it gets to the War Within. Any thoughts on that? So I suspect that classic as just a general thing is going to continue going. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it's going to go to Warlords of Draenor at some point. I think it's going to go to Legion. I think it's going to go to BFA at some point. I think we'll eventually get there. To me, there are two questions specifically about that. Well, and the biggest one is, what is the cadence then? because right now we're getting a classic update or getting a new classic expansion very slightly faster than we got those expansions in the first place when they were actually normally released. It's not by a ton in some cases, but it is slightly faster of an overall cadence, which means that at some point we will catch up. At some point, it will get to the point where it's like, yes, the last Titan just came out and it's time for Midnight Classic. Probably not that quickly, but it will. That would eventually be a concern. Um, that's one to worry about later on. It's not something the team really has to worry about too much right now. But as we're talking about like getting towards midnight and getting towards the last Titan in retail, and then looking to Classic and going, okay, yeah, they're going to do Mop Classic, and then they're going to do WAD Classic, and then they're going to do Legion Classic. Now we're at the point where like, okay, BFA Classic and Shadowlands Classic, and then Dragonflight Classic. Like they do have all those expansions still there, but we're starting to get into the very modern game, and we're starting to get to a point where the game is not so different than it is right now in retail compared to back then. So there is a bit of the like cadence and how often these things are coming out to think about. That means like eventually, just to the part of the question asking about will they go through all of the expansions until they get to the War Within? I expect that they will, and I expect that it will continue past the War Within. I'm expecting this to be a like Blizzard's new strategy is essentially to re-release an expansion pack every like once it's been out for like 5 or 6 years or something like that. That would eventually be where we get with this whole thing. Obviously, Mop Classic was a lot longer ago than that, but you know, as they continue on this faster cadence, they'll eventually get there. As far as the fresh classic servers go, we know that they have said they're going to go to TBC. They haven't said anything about whether they're going to go past TBC. So I know a lot of people actually really do want a like constantly available TBC server. I think there's a lot that the classic team needs to figure out about like what time, like when's the right time to bring back Wrath Classic, when's the right time to bring back TBC Classic. And I think that's part of why these fresh servers are going to move to TBC, is so that they can experiment with that a little bit. They can learn a little bit from the fact that by doing it, okay, how many people actually do continue with these fresh servers and how many do actually carry over into TBC when that happens. So I think there's a lot that it's sort of Blizzard trying to figure all that out right now still. And it's, as a result, it's tough to really say where it's going to end up. Personally, I think, I don't think that I know a lot of people said like the best solution is just leave them all up. If I want to go play TBC, I should be able to go play TBC. If I want to go play Cataclysm, I should be able to go play Cataclysm. That's not really super feasible, at least not for the size that the classic team currently is and for the size of the player base that would then be on each of those servers. I think that, yes, there would be some people playing, but it starts to get spread around a little bit too much. And then if any sort of issue or anything comes up, there's like this expectation from Blizzard that there will be constant ongoing support for everything that happens. And that will just start to get out of hand if they essentially are running like 12 different versions of the game all at the same time. Like that's just not going to happen. Not realistically, that's just not going to happen. So I do think the idea of some of them like coming and going is the way to do it. And the idea of doing that through fresh classic servers where maybe they can say, okay, we'll see how many people move from this fresh classic server into TBC when that comes out. Okay, enough people moved. Maybe we move these servers into Wrath of the Lich King now. Maybe we move those servers into Cataclysm now. And then maybe it's time to start a new round of fresh classic servers and they just keep this cycle going. Maybe that's the way they would end up wanting to do that. I'm not sure. There's a lot of different ways that it could be done. And I think the biggest thing about Classic is literally Blizzard's approach is and has been quite clearly do a thing, see if that's what the player base wants, and then learn from that what the player base does want and continue trying to do that as much as possible. Like the Classic team has been very, very receptive to what are the things that this player base actually wants to see and trying to cater directly to that audience. So that was a lot of words. Hopefully that answered the question. I'm going to move on to the last question I pulled out for today. This one comes from Revan992, who says, question for the lore master. In the index of Chronicles Volume 3, there's an Easter egg in the index called Lil Zoomkin, who does not appear in the book. I did an internet search and couldn't find anything. Any clue who that character is? So I picked this question out because this serves as a good opportunity for me to clarify something. I am not some massive World of Warcraft lore buff. Like I know a fair amount. In fact, I think I know more than most people, more than average about Warcraft lore, but I don't know like every minute little detail. I am not a lore master. There is a guy whose name is Sean Copeland, who used to go by the name Lore as well. He spelled it with two L's. It was very confusing, and we didn't realize that we were doing that until both of us were pretty established with those names at Blizzard. So it just stayed confusing. But as a result, we constantly got each other mixed up. That is a different guy, and that he is still around and still doing stuff at Blizzard. And he is a WoW historian. Like, his job is to know everything there is to know about World of Warcraft. Sometimes people think that guy is me. I'm not Sean Copeland. We've had a lot of great conversations over the years, but we are definitely different people. So I don't know is the honest answer to this question. I haven't picked up Chronicles Volume 3. I don't know. At first I thought like, well, maybe Lil Zoomkin, isn't that the name of the battle pet? But no, the battle pet was just named Moonkin Hatchling. So I don't know. Either way, this was a good opportunity for me to clarify, like, yes, I know a bunch of stuff about Warcraft lore, and usually in cases like especially after last week's episode, I was like, okay, hold on, let me actually go back and look and make sure that I'm right about how much lore was actually in Warcraft 1. And I do a little bit of research, and yes, I was correct about that. But I'm not someone who can just like offhand name every random lore character, and especially if like what you did is exactly what I would do in this situation. Like, Lil Zoomkin, what is that? Let's Google it, and nothing comes up. So no idea whatsoever. That's a great question for the other guy, Sean Copeland. If you get a chance to ask him about it at some point, maybe he'll know. But I have no idea. I've got no concept of what that thing is. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We will be back next week, hopefully with some new topic to talk about, but I have no idea what it's going to be just yet. Thanks once again to all of my patrons who help keep this channel running. I really, really appreciate all the support. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/Devilor. Patrons get a few fun little perks, such as they usually get to see these episodes a little bit early. You get audio-only versions of the episodes that can also connect to your Spotify, so you can just listen while you're on the go somewhere instead of staring at my weird face the whole time that I'm talking about stuff. I assume most of you like play the video and then minimize it and go do something else anyway, but who knows? Maybe somebody's been sitting here watching me the whole time. But you get that as a patron. And you also get first priority on having any questions answered. If you're a patron, you can go over to Patreon, find the listing for this episode, and there's a form you can fill out. If you fill out that form, that makes sure that you get first crack at having your question answered here on the show. Also, once again, I have a merch store. I'm wearing a bunch of the stuff right now. You can check that out at devillore.com. There's a bunch of new stuff that I just put up there. And I'm told that the vendor that all this is through, if you're interested in getting anything as like a holiday gift for something, for somebody or something, I'm told that around December 11th is the cutoff date for that. If you're planning to buy a sounds good, makes sense, I don't know, coaster, like one of what's sitting right here. You're planning to buy a sounds good coaster because you've got just that perfect that family member for whom that's the perfect gift. First of all, your family sounds awesome, but secondly, you have until basically December 11th to make that order. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out once again. I'll see you later.